My guest today is Dr. Margaret Byrne of UGM Consulting, a boutique consulting firm that helps organisations to achieve strategic outcomes. Her career highlights include securing $1 million in sponsorship for her research, which we're going to hear about, getting 3 of her films broadcast on SBS, and winning a contract with the Chinese government in Beijing. Welcome to In Her Shoes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us. Tell me about the research you've done, because it's about how men and women work together side by side.
It is indeed. Well, maybe the first thing is what motivated me to do it. I actually got tired of people saying men are like this, women are like that, with lots of generalizations and based on very spurious data. So I thought I would collect something quite robust. And that meant filming. So I took cameras into about 28 organizations and filmed men and women regularly talking together in normal teams and everyday meetings, and then took all of that footage away and analyzed it to see, well, what did that say about how do men communicate, how do women communicate, because I looked at men-only meetings, and I looked at women-only meetings, and I looked at meetings where men and women work together. So would you like to know what I found?
Yes, please. Perhaps 3 or 4 of the key things that you found.
Well, I found that mostly men and women communicate in identical ways. This idea that men are from Mars, women are from Venus is not supported in my research. So if I had to put a percentage on it, I'd say that 95% of the way that men and women communicate is identical, and 5% is different. And it's that 5% that really matters, especially for women who are seeking to make their way to leadership roles in organizations. Because there's no doubt about it that the gold standard for how a leader looks and behaves is actually how men behave in men-only meetings. In the women-only meetings, I saw that when women are operating with no men present, they're often quite different from the way they behave when they're operating with men side by side.
In what way? Can you give us one example?
Well, for example, in women-only meetings, they tend to be highly collaborative, lots of laughter, lots of overlapping talk. An idea, even the germ of an idea, an embryonic idea, is put out on the table, and all the women work together to flesh it out. And so there's it's kind of like a jazz jam session, or a riffing on different people's ideas with different things being thrown into the ring, so that at the end of it there is something that's much more fully fleshed out. But when women try to do that in meetings with men, often men don't quite understand what they're doing, because men-only meetings tend to have the whole idea set out in a fully elaborated form. And women have to get used to doing that if they're going to play the game and win in an arena where it's a male style, still in Australia, that is the gold standard.
When we look at the area of perhaps it's recruitment, perhaps it's assigning women to leadership roles, one of the things I was reading in your work was that men are judged on perceived potential, whereas women are judged on their history. That doesn't seem to match up.
Well, look, it doesn't, and it's a function of anybody, whether that person is female or whether they're, for example, from another culture, got another culture in their background, or they've got a very different track record, you know, in a different sector. So for whatever reason, they're seen as higher risk. So when somebody is seen as higher risk, then people who are making the choice to put that person in a significant role seem to want to have a lot more to offset the risk, a lot more that's definitive. So people want to reduce the sense of risk when they're promoting someone who's seen as different.
And we as women are still seen as different enough to have that bias occur.
Yes, and what I found was that often that bias is an unconscious bias. So when I talked, for example, to senior men who might be making these decisions, they would often say, oh, in our organization, I'm the diversity champion. you know, our diversity policy, it's a thing close to my heart. You know, I sleep with it under my pillow at night. I'm well known for my mentoring of women. And so even my film crew were saying afterwards, oh, you'd have liked that, Margaret. You know, that is right on. You know, that's fantastic. And then we would follow that individual around with cameras for a few days, you see, and actually capture what the person really does. And so the interesting question, was there a discrepancy between what the person thought their values were and what the values were that we could infer from the person's behaviour?
My guess is going to be yes.
Yes, yes. So often these biases are not articulated, and that makes them tricky for women, because sometimes you're in a situation where you feel that there is a bias, but because it's not direct, because it's indirect, because it's woven into the wallpaper, if you like, then it's harder to challenge and name. So in that sense, I would say that many of the biases that women face are trickier to deal with than at the beginning of my career, where we saw much more overt bias and out-and-out discrimination, where you could point at something and name it and say, that's outrageous, I can't believe you said that. But when things are subtle, it's harder to pick it.
I want to ask about, because you're talking about diversity within organisations, and people have diversity policies, inclusion policies, and yet the playing field is still not even. Why is it that despite these initiatives, organisations still don't reflect perhaps what we think we're demonstrating as a fair modern day workplace?
I think there's still a split, which is an unhelpful one, between what are the drivers of value in an organisation, no matter what the sector is, whether it's public sector, not-for-profit or corporate sector. So what makes that organisation tick? What's its purpose? What's it seeking to achieve? Whether that is a reporting back to stakeholders or whether it's actually to shareholders. So that is seen as one bunch of things. And another bunch of things is how we're going to manage the people within the organisation. So when those two are brought together, there's a lot more impetus. So one of the ways that we work with organisations is by linking diversity initiatives very much to drivers of value.
Great. And
actually owning too the downside of diversity, so that some of these things come out of our mouths rather than the naysayers in the organisation. So some of the downsides are that there is research that does show, robust research, that the more diverse an organisation or a community or a city or a country is, the more risk there is that we will have conflict and we'll have loss of trust and loss of confidence, because we have different views on how things should be done. So diversity's got a downside that has to be managed, as well as an upside, which is obviously much more innovation in problem solving. But if you don't acknowledge the downside and show how people can manage that as a risk in their business, and then link the whole lot to what they're seeking to achieve through those drivers of value, then what happens is you get a diversity policy and diversity strategies that float free from what the organisation's about. And so there's no traction, there is no connection. An example might be little women's networks where women can get together and have a moan.
Have a moan.
Have a moan. Yeah, it's not actually achieving anything.
Right.
It's not achieving anything strategic. And that's seen as, well, we've got a diversity tick. Right. We've got this women's network where the women, poor dears, can get together and whinge. And that's what we're doing and tick. But it's not actually harnessing diversity in any kind of strategic way.
So just to bring this together then, we've seen that it's not a level playing field. We've looked at some of the possible downsides of diversity when it's not matched closely with the objectives of the organisation. What can men and women who have perhaps started those initiatives do to go, okay, we've done this, perhaps we've got our women's group, perhaps we have a policy in place. How do we check that it's achieving what we set out to do. Do you have a checklist of a couple of ideas that questions they need to ask themselves?
I think that the first thing is for people to take a snapshot of where they are currently, because if you're going to track progress, you have to know progress from where to where. Mm. So metrics become really important, qualitative and quantitative metrics, a combination of the two. So for example, where are the women currently? What levels are they at in the organisation? How many of them are sitting in our talent programme? How many of them are getting significant opportunities, you know, those exciting, perhaps international projects? So we take a number of measures, not just numbers of women, but where they are and what they're doing as part of a cultural health check. And then we look at where we'd like to be so that there is a sense of what the journey is from and to, and what are the things that will have to happen. So then it becomes really important to set those metrics and hold people's feet to the fire. And sometimes that means very down-to-earth and practical things, not airy-fairy. It's got to get down to, for example, how do senior people speak to all their more junior individuals? Because very often what we find, again when we take cameras in, is that senior people, often men, will speak more and reward, without realising it, to the people that are like themselves, in other words, more junior men. And when you even, in one organisation we set a task, all senior men had to have a conversation of at least 3 minutes duration every week with every woman in their area. And that actually stymied them. They said, well, what do I say? So we had to write a script. So we had to teach them how to come up and say, so hello, and insert name. How are you doing? What are you working on this week? And then stop, zip it, and listen. This is called back channeling, and women find it very supportive as a listening device. So we taught men to do this. And then to say simple things, 2 or 3 simple questions like, so what have you learned from that? And how could we use that to help the business? And then the last question was, would you be willing to talk about that in our next team meeting? And then just leave it there. So we had men sign up to have that simple scripted conversation once a week for 6 weeks, and then to see the difference in their business.
That would be transformational.
Transformational. Yeah. But because it was highly specific, they were able to agree to do it. Whereas when you say to people, do you support a diversity initiative, or the idea that women and men should have equal merit in our... Of course they say yes, but they don't know what would that look like on a daily basis, and what would I be doing differently if I was going to live that. So that's an example of something highly specific that every senior person can do, actually male or female, that makes a world of difference in 6 weeks. I guarantee it.
Dr. Byrne, thank you for joining us.